Curtis, we are rolling.
Okay, dynamite. So first of all, just so we identify you correctly, because we'll put a little label over your interview, if you could state for me your name, first and last, and spell it for us so we get it spelled correctly.
Okay, my name is Barbara Brennan Bennett, and the spelling on that is Barbara. Maiden name that most Dallas knew me by is Brennan, Brennan, and then my married name is Bennett, Bennett. And my employee number was 2441, and I started in March of '79.
Awesome, great. So, so before we get into some of the specific questions, I wonder if you could just kind of sketch out your career as a flight attendant, a little synopsis of what your career, when you started, how many years you've been flying, how you liked it, how it's been for you.
Okay, well, I started flying in March of '79, and we were on probation for 6 months, and I was approached in my 3rd month to come to a meeting from some gal in the lounge, and I said, sure. And I expected to see, 50, 100 people there, and I walked into this room, and there was 3 gals and 2 guys. And I remember starting to walk out, and they said, are you Barbara? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, this is the meeting. And I said, well, what is the meeting about? And they said, well, we want to organize the flight attendants. And I said, oh, okay, that sounds good. And they said, we asked the supervisors for a junior person. And so I was the junior person in the room, still on probation. And got to talking and trying to find a location. So we chose my parents' house, which was close to Love Field. And we had meetings in the morning and the evening because everybody had shortbacks and turnarounds, so you could always make one or the other. And so once my mom found out, she told me to, I was going to serve refreshments in the morning with juice, coffee, and sodas, and then I would do the evening with sodas and munchies and chips and things like that. And I told her, I said, I only make $300 a month and $5 a trip. I said, I don't know how I can afford that. So she said, too bad, made me do it. And all the flight attendants showed up. We were in hot pants. And Steve Palmason, I think was his name, was the pilot that gave the explanation about what if we were to become an association. And then Paul Quinn, the dispatcher, gave a presentation on why we should go union, and specifically TWU. So we took a vote in the morning after their presentation, and it was kind of split. And then Paul and Steve had a few scotches with my dad in the bar area. And so when they came out to do the presentations in the evening, Paul just said, oh, you just need to go with the union. They have all your resources. And since he told us that, everyone just voted union. So that's how we ended up being part of the union, at least the TWU 556, I believe. There was earlier with Sandra Bogan and some agreements and things like that done. And I just know this is when we officially voted in TWU. So
I see. So that was the creation of 556.
I believe
when
so.
that happened.
I believe so. And there were some senior flight attendants to me that were kind of organizing it and putting it together. I remember, since I was so new, a little bit naive, that I got called in by the boss, and she said, are you the one that put flyers in all the flight attendant mailboxes? And I said, yeah, it's directions to my parents' house for a flight attendant meeting. And she goes, well, yes, but what is the meeting about? And I said, well, we're trying to organize, and then we'll elect some people to be our spokespersons. And she said, we're not approving this union stuff, and you're on probation, and you could be fired for that because you're not allowed to use the mailboxes, and we don't approve of the meeting. And I said, oh, I was so naive. I just said, but when they called me, I said, organization and getting some spokesperson. I said, that always sounded like a good idea to me. That's not a good idea, because I didn't understand what was going on politically with the company. And she granted me that I could stay on. I wasn't going to be fired for it, but next time just don't do things like that.
Wow, that's great. So that's how I got started. And then how involved were you in the union going forward in the years afterwards? And why was it important to you to be involved?
Well, I got involved on several committees in the beginning. We would go to meetings and, there'd just be probably a small percentage that would show up at the meetings. They were still not sure about union. And so they would, for instance, say, we need to start an election committee. I think that was like year 1 or 2. And would anybody be interested? Nobody raised their hand. And so I said, well, is that just counting paper or, a few ballots? I said, I can do that. Well, it turns out I was the chairman of the original election committee. And eventually, I can't remember how much further on, a year or so, that they gave me a co-chair, which was Rebecca Kelly. And I think I served on that committee for about 10 years. So I counted the ballots for the election of officers and for all the contracts. And in the beginning, I would sit in the lounge with the ballots, with the box, and people would come up to me and say, what are we voting on? And I'd explain it, and then they would take the ballot and I would take their name off the seniority list and they would drop it right there in front of everybody. So there got to be quite a bit of discussion going on sometimes, somewhat adversarial at times. So the next time we did it, we took a small office out of the lounge and people came in one at a time, to make their voting. And then, of course, the election committee evolved as we created new bases, and we had mail-in ballots eventually. And I'm sure now they're probably doing digital or something. But then they needed help with the scheduling committee, so I did that for about 5 or 6 years. Then they needed help with COPE, the Political Action Committee. So I spent some time in Washington, D.C., going to different senators' offices, knocking on the door and talking about our group and everything. Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, I remember, the California people. And I hit Arizona and Texas, the bases and everything. So I did that a few times and was on that COPE committee for maybe 4 years. And then there was a galley design committee that they asked me to serve on, and I went to the hangar and measured everything in the galley by the millimeters and created a design that we thought would work well for the flight attendants, as well as I invited a provisioner to come and make sure that it was going to be easy for them to work the galley also. And so after we spent a couple weekends putting all that together, that presentation, we found out that Dennis Lardon, our boss, had contacted the galley committee and signed a contract, and it was all done. And we never even looked at any of our stuff. So that was kind of the old days, We didn't always communicate that well. So several committees, pretty much whenever certain things needed to be done, sometimes I was called to help, and I did that. One of the stories that everyone likes me to tell is when I got bit on the butt on the airplane, and they find that pretty funny. We were in our orange hot pants, and I was serving C position, and we had overwing exits. We had a lounge where the chairs faced each other, and I had come out with my drinks, and I was facing aft, and row 13 faced aft in the lounge, and I finished serving to the left, and then I started serving to the right, and when I turned, the gentleman sitting 13D decided to bite me on my butt. Well, I was kind of shocked and didn't really know what to say, and I just kind of was speechless for a minute, and I just turned and said, "You're not allowed to touch me like that." And I went to the galley, and I was just kind of befuddled, and I remember Ruthie Matter was flying with me back there, and I told her what happened, and after she dropped her mouth open for a while, and then she just started laughing hysterically, which then I started laughing, and I said, "The nerve of some people." And so I went back out, and he was drinking gin and tonic, and I offered second round to everybody on cocktails. But then a few weeks later, we had a union meeting, and I came in from reserve, still in hot pants uniform, and I was at the meeting, and Channel 8 News, ABC News, came to the meeting, and her name was Jane Horowitz, was the reporter. And she was there with lights, camera, and action, and she wanted to interview someone in uniform. Well, pretty much everyone in the room heard the story about me being bit. So she started to, they just all pointed at me to be interviewed. And I remember I sat next to the president, Susie Goodman. I said, if she asks me anything I don't want to answer, I'm going to look at you. Because we had been told quite firmly several times that crew members never spoke to the press. That was a job for headquarters, and we were not supposed to do this. So again, I was like, am I going to get fired for this? And she started to interview me, and I remember I was telling the story, and I got to the part where he bit me, and I hesitated thinking, oh, my mother's going to be so mad if I say butt or ass or anything. So I hesitated for a minute, and I said, on the derriere during service, and everyone got kicked out of that. Actually, some of the passengers recognized me too, because it was on the news, both Dallas and Houston. So that was a
Wow.
fun early story.
When did they get rid of the hot pants, and how did that come about? Did the union play a role in pushing back on that?
Yes, actually, you know, you would think that money would be the most thing to drive the group together for the union, but initially, the biggest thing that everybody was mad about was having to wear the hats and the hot pants. So it was our uniform that really got everyone together in solidarity for the union and voted in a contract because we wanted so badly, everyone wanted out of the hot pants. So that was, I think, around 79. And then we were given a wrap skirt that we could put over our hot pants, and we could wear that to and from the aircraft. But once on board, we were supposed to take the skirt off and wear our hot pants. But eventually nobody did that, and so everybody was wearing the skirt. And then we complained about the cold months in Texas. It can get pretty cold, especially Lubbock, Midland and stuff, and we didn't have coats, so we had a raincoat. So they finally allowed us to have slacks for 3 months of the year, December through February. So we finally got some pants, and that was a big deal. And then I think shortly after that, maybe 82 or 3, we hired the males. And once, of course, we hired males, we didn't have to wear hot pants anymore, because they didn't want to see the boys in the hot pants.
But you think having the union gave you more sort of power?
Yes.
So if you could state it just that simply, plainly, and go from there.
Being that we had the union organized at that time, and everybody was so forceful about the hot pants issue, the union was our power, you know, to negotiate with the company that this was the number one issue, not our hours or our pay, but the number one issue was our hot pants, and the union represented us and, you know, continued to push on that. And then a few years after that, the weight check was a big issue, because as the women started to get older and had babies, and some of them struggled with a little bit of weight here and there, and so we were tired of being weighed in. We wanted to have our worth, you know, evaluated on something other than our weight. And so the union several times would go to Herb and Colleen on the issue. I wrote a long letter to Herb and got a long letter back, how it's important for the flight attendants to represent the company in a favorable way. And so the weight check just helps with the grooming, you know, to make sure that we have a little extra edge over the other airlines by looking trim in our hot pants. And our weight check actually was less, about 5 pounds under what the ticket agents could wear, and they were in hot pants, different color. So the ticket agents were getting 5 pounds more for the same height than we were. And we were like, how do you choose? It's so arbitrary, these numbers that you're choosing. So we continued to fight that battle for a couple of years, and then finally they surrendered to the union that we didn't have to start weighing in every month, you know. And then once you got on weight check because you were 2 or 3 pounds over, you had to weigh weekly and show progress, or they could suspend you if you didn't show progress. So the union was extremely instrumental then
Wow,
on
that's
that
great.
fight. I was on that kind of fight with Mary Ravella. Yeah.
Looking back over the past 50 years, what are a couple of other like significant milestones or wins that you feel like been sort of advancements in the workplace that the union's been instrumental in?
Well, when Susie Goodman was president, I'm not sure of the year, but she did a terrific job of negotiating a contract. So we weren't paid $300 a month and $5 a trip. And over the next 5 years with the TWU contract with Susie Goodman as our president, we had a tremendous change in our pay and in our work hours. We could still work 12-hour days, and we still had short backs that had like 6 hours crew rest, but she was very instrumental with TWU to get shorter work days and at least a minimum of time on the ground, because the short backs you took in the terminator and left on the originator, and sometimes there wasn't really hardly enough time to get to the hotel and back, so that was a big milestone when we got that contract. We were all excited about that. And then what are some of the others? Well, if you were on reserve, you sat reserve twice a year until you were at 5 years, and then you were permanently released from reserve duty. Well, once we opened the bases of Houston and Phoenix, there was really, everybody was under 5 years in the new bases, and no one was under 5 years in the senior base. So who was going to sit reserve now in the Dallas base? So there became a huge fight among the flight attendants, and it was basically the seniority list, top and bottom. The bottom of the list wanted everyone to have to serve duty, all the way to Sandra Bogan at the top. And the top gals that had been off reserve over 5 years for a while, they fought to make sure that the junior people sat straight reserve until they were senior enough to get off reserve. So pretty much the way all the other airlines do it. So you come on, you sit reserve until you can hold a line. Well, there was such a huge fight going on, and I was the election committee, and I was hearing all about it from everyone, that at one of the union meetings, the negotiators were there, and everyone was talking and complaining about either or. And I had this epiphany, and I said, well, why don't we do like a combination or something where instead of 5 years, we do a percentage and say the top percentage of each base is off, and this percentage people will rotate, as needed. I said, I don't know what the numbers would be. I haven't worked on it, but we could do maybe something like that. And the negotiators just looked at me, deer in the headlights, turned around, walked away, and next thing I know, we had a third option called the combination. And it was 35% and above was off reserve in each base. So if you were junior in Dallas, but you went to Houston, you could be off reserve senior. And the people in Dallas that were below that 35 line, they were over 5 years, but they had to start rotating into reserve, and or else they had the option.
And the union was really important in getting all that.
Yes, and the union helped us negotiate all that as far as how it would work and everything, and people then had the option of staying in their home city like Dallas and rotating through reserve, or they could change bases and go to Houston where they're off reserve and then be a commuter. So it gave the flight attendants, once again, the union gave the flight attendants a lot more options for quality of life.
Great. Looking back on the history of the union at Southwest, how do you feel about the achievements that have been gained, and your role in participating on that?
Well, we were small, and there was just a small group of flight attendants, and then even a smaller group that participated in organizing and creating new ideas for the flight attendants. And so I would say that I got tapped, my shoulder got tapped many times as I served on the election committee and the galley and the scheduling committee. Back then we were using flow charts. So they would actually, when we went to work and we didn't know what our schedule would be, we had the flow charts, which is the airplane from originator to terminator and this aircraft number. And there, when I started, there was 14 airplanes. And we had to find our trips on the flow charts, and that's how we read which plane we went to and which flights we were going to work that day. So eventually we started, with the union's help, we worked with the pilots too, and because they had a much better scheduling system, and started printed out actually trips that you could see for your day and not work the flow charts. So between the union and some of our senior gals, we got the schedules done a lot better. There was a huge cry against 4-day trips, and I worked on the scheduling committee, and it was really tough to take the flow charts and try to find the breaks to make sure that person got home by the second or third night. There was just, it was sometimes impossible.
So yeah, so a lot of work going into that. So just as on an emotional level, how do you feel about being a significant part of this legacy that has been built up?
When you're there doing it, it's just every day. You get up and do what you need to do, and fly your trips. And then I was always taught by my family to give a little extra to the company that you work for, which was the flight attendant group, and that was the union group. So to me, when they called me for service in one department or another, and committees and stuff like that, it was just normal to step up and take care of it. Now I look back on it and I see that there's a wealth of information that I was able to be instrumental in, and it does make you feel kind of proud that the combination reserve system, I believe they're still using, and that was just something that flipped off the top of my head at a meeting one day. So I sit there and think there's $1 billion airline out there using a system that I actually came up with. So that's kind of makes me proud. And
how do you feel about TWU and the support that the union has provided throughout all that time?
Well, they did send me to DC for a few weeks. I did the George Meany School, and I learned a lot about the history of TWU and all the wonderful things that they had been a part of, before we had joined. And I just found them very supportive, and they had so many resources that we really needed as far as finding out contract rules from other companies and other airlines, and they were just a huge resource for us growing. So it was great to have them.
And do you have a sense, just kind of ballpark, how many union members you had, when you started among flight attendants, and then compare that to where it's gotten to, and how that makes you feel?
Yes, in the beginning, we had maybe 100 flight attendants, and probably 20% were union, signed up and paid their dues. It was optional. And a lot of the flight attendants still weren't sure, what a union was, and, if they wanted to be part of it. And of course it cost, a few dollars a month, and they didn't want to voluntarily sign up for that paycheck deduction. But
and now how many are there?
Well, I'm retired, but I think I heard a number around 23,000 flight attendants, something like that, which is, like I said, I started with 14 airplanes, so I can't even imagine how huge that is. And I understand there's bases all around the U.S., and TWU did a lot to guide us into where we are today. We have representatives in every base, and if you have a grievance, it's easy to go file it, and there's always somebody there to talk to, and there's toll-free numbers, which now I guess there's nothing long distance, so I don't know if they even have the toll-free number anymore. But my business card, when I was board member at large, it has the phone. I found a couple recently, and it has the phone number, the fax number. No email, no website. There was no computers. We did everything by hand with the schedules. You just use your brain. And computers have really made everything so much better when they started coming into play. And then I was put on the computer committee to teach people how to sign in when we went digital. At the Phoenix base, I was pulled to instruct people how to use the computer and how to sign in and find their trips, and if they wanted to, eventually we could print our trip from the computer. So you had it, and you knew who your crew members were and everything from the computer.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It made a
Yeah,
huge difference.
yeah.
Yeah, but there was one gal I was teaching that I really enjoyed, that as I'm telling them how to click on this and do that, and I said, okay, is anybody, not used a computer before or anything? And she's looked at me, and she had picked up the mouse like a remote control to the TV, and she goes, mine's not working. So we had quite an education during that period.
Right, that's wild.
Mm-hmm.
Well, listen, Barbara, you've been great. Thank you so much. We
Well-
got a lot of tremendous stuff from you, and
I'm sure there's
tremendous,
100 more
yeah.
stories.
Yeah, right. And how many years were you a flight attendant?
I retired just after 21 years. So I retired just before 9/11. So I was really thinking about them being stuck in their hotel rooms and for days at different places, away from families where they had babysitters. I mean, I couldn't imagine how bad that was.
Yeah.
But I had been commuting for a long time because once I married, my husband worked at different cities, so I had to commute a lot, and that just wore me down quite a bit. So
Yeah.
I went ahead and took retirement.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What a beautiful. All right.